any of us to know the results of that, and it would satisfy the American people to know that their resource, a shared taxpayer resource, copper on federal land, is not in violation of sanctions resolution by this Congress against Iran. With that, let me reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask my friend from Arizona, I have no more requests for time on general debate, and if he's prepared to yield back his time on general debate, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And at this point, I don't have any further speakers, but so
I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In closing, let me just summarize, I think, the three important points in this debate. And 687 reflects all the previous five variations of this legislation. You're doing a post-NEPA with no enforcement. You're turning the regulatory process and the oversight process to the state of Arizona, who have weak mining laws, and also are not in a position to make the requirements that have to be part of this prior to any land exchange. That would be hydrology. That would be sacred sites consultation. That would be a NEPA review as to water issues that can occur, subsurface damage to the area around Apache Leap and Oak Flats. Those become important issues. The sanctions issue, important to resolve against Iran, that we are not in violation by creating a partnership and an exchange with a foreign corporation that is doing business with Iran. And I think the most important issue is the taxpayer issue. The taxpayer issue, because as we here in this Congress, and certainly many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and this side of the aisle as well, talk so much about the taxpayer, talk about so much about budget cuts and how to relieve the taxpayer, talk so much about deficits and how we need to reduce those deficits to the benefit of the taxpayer. And we have no jobs bill but to help the taxpayer, but we talk about those things. And here we have before us trading away federal land in an exchange, not knowing what the real value is, because that's proprietary, not knowing what the real production is going to be by the company, because that's proprietary, not requiring the same regulatory process, NEPA process, that we require of any other land exchange, because this is a special deal. And at the end of the day, exported copper processed outside the United States, one, no gain to the taxpayer. No royalty requirement, lost to the taxpayer. No real understanding of the full value of what's underneath that ground and what protections and mitigations would have to be put in place in order to make sure that those areas are taken care of, not a problem. Violation of the government-to-government consultation on sacred sites and cultural sites, we ignore that too. I think this rush to judgment, and it's been 10 years of a rush to judgment, if the company 10 years ago would have agreed to do a post-NEPA, we would have all the information this Congress needed to make an informed, due diligent decision. If 10 years ago they would have sat down with the tribes and honestly and forthrightly and equally did government-to-government consultation, we could be on our way. If 10 years ago they would have made the guarantees about fair return to the taxpayer, how much ore is going to be domestically marketed and remain in the United States, and how much is going to be processed, we could be on our way. That was 10 years ago. It's the same piece of legislation, same insistence on the company, and it is a bad deal for the taxpayers, and it is a bad deal for the state of Arizona, where we would be the poster child for one of the worst expedited sweetheart deals at the expense of the American taxpayer and at the expense of the people of Arizona, the tribes of Arizona, and the revenue that that county in Pinal enjoys. Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
The gentleman from Arizona has 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield, how much time do you need? 2 minutes to gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Kirkpatrick.
The gentlelady from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this legislation. I thank my colleague, Mr. Grijalva, for yielding time to me, but also thank him for his work and his comments. I also want to thank my colleague across the aisle, Congressman Gosar, for working with me in a bipartisan way on this legislation. And I just want people to know that the town of Superior is a small town. It's in the Copper Corridor of Arizona. Arizona's unemployment is higher than the national unemployment, but in our rural communities it's even higher. And this is an area where people have been miners for generations, and they want these jobs. And you know, if the folks in a small town like Superior can come together, we as members of Congress can come together. And I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation. It's an opportunity for us as members of Congress to show the American people that, yes, we can work together and get things done. Let's make sure that this gets done. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentleman.
Time. I'm still prepared to close.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Let me thank, with this I'll close. At some point, we as members of this august body have to really define what bipartisanship is. The last time that this bill was before us and passed the House, it had 7 members from this side of the aisle, Democrats, voted for it. 8 members from the other side of the aisle voted against it. And I mention that because this bill is about precedents. It is about the kind of precedents that we are going to set as members of this body, ignoring our due diligence, ignoring the fact that we have before us a piece of legislation that has failed to get out of the Senate, and more importantly, that on 2 occasions the administration has indicated strongly they do not support it. So we'll go on with this exercise in futility at the expense of real business that this Congress should be doing for the American people. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and thank the Chairman.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a few comments here in response to what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been saying regarding this legislation. And certainly there is a great deal of hyperbole going on that I think just simply doesn't meet the straight face test in many respects. First of all, it's been implied and maybe said specifically by one of my colleagues that this legislation waives environmental laws. Mr. Chairman, I want to say very specifically this does not waive any environmental laws. But let me walk back to how this works, because my friends on the other side of the aisle are talking about NEPA review. Well, NEPA is a pretty important environmental law. I certainly understand that. But let's put this in context. First of all, this legislation is a land exchange legislation. You exchange this piece of land for this piece of land. Now, that is a policy decision that we are debating and making here on the floor of the House. We are making a policy decision on exchanging this piece of land for another piece of land. Now, if that exchange is done and this becomes law, then yes, there will be a copper mine on that land that's exchanged. We acknowledge that. But my friends on the outer side of the aisle suggest that we should have a NEPA review before we make a law. How absurd is that? Are we going to have a NEPA review on every law that Mr. Chairman, don't we make the policy here in this country? And yet their criticism is that we are not allowing a NEPA review before we make policy. I did not know the NEPA policy said that before there is a land exchange or before Congress passes a statute, you have to have a NEPA review. Yet that's what their argument is in this case. Now, after the land exchange, then the process starts of developing a mine. Then you'll go through all of those environmental loopholes, or hoops I should say, that you normally go through in this sort of activity. So I just want to clarify that. I hope that my friends on the other side of the aisle aren't suggesting by their argument of a NEPA review that we should have a NEPA review before on Congress's action. That doesn't, a NEPA review on a statute? That doesn't make sense. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a good piece of legislation. It's been worked very hard by Mr. Gosar and others from the Arizona delegation on a bipartisan basis. Obviously, Arizonians broadly support this, at least by the evidence that we see in the media and so forth. So I think it's a good bill. We have several amendments. We'll debate those and we'll address those issues during that debate. But I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources printed in the bill shall be considered an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part A of the House Report 113-215. Each such amendment may be offered only in order printed in the report and by a member designated in the report and shall be considered read. Shall be debatable for a time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent. Shall not be subject to an amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider the amendment number 1 printed in Part A of the House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 351, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, a member opposed, will each control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Repeatedly, we've heard this bill is about jobs. We've heard it a lot, and we continue to hear it. We have to pass this bill, so goes the refrain, because it's about jobs in a part of Arizona that really needs jobs. And I understand how important it is to help rural parts of the state. I understand how important it is to help rural communities across the country. I talk about this all the time, to try to work to advance a policy agenda that translates into real, meaningful opportunities for all Americans and those sectors of our state, as was pointed out by my colleague, Congresswoman Kirkpatrick, in which unemployment is very, very severe. That's why I think it's important to make sure this bill translates to real and meaningful jobs for the communities that will bear the biggest burden of the proposed mine. My amendment would require that the remote operating center for the mine be located in the town of Superior, Arizona, or adjacent to another mining community within the Copper Triangle. Modern block cave mines use a range of automation technology, and most of the human labor is done off-site at the remote operations center. Like other mines operated by Rio Tinto, Resolution Copper's parent company, the remote operations center will likely be in a metro area. Rio Tinto is presently operating its Pilbara, Australia mine from 800 miles away in a large metro center. Our amendment will ensure that this is not the case in Superior. If this legislation is really about jobs and lifting up the local economy, it is important to guarantee that local residents will have access to the jobs that were promised and the jobs that were created. My amendment guarantees that the jobs this mine does create will benefit the local community. This amendment, at the very minimum, will realize some real jobs if this legislation were to ever be implemented. When one reads and hears Rio Tinto brag about automation and technology and the progress in mining where less labor is needed, and listen to the wild variations about jobs from 3,700 to 5,000 to 1,200 to 1,400. Even the recent one from the company's own website is 1,400. One asks, what's the real number? And since no mining plan of operations has been submitted, it's impossible to analyze or estimate. So how do we know? There is nothing in H.R. 687 that guarantees jobs for Superior, Arizona, or any other nearby mining community. With my amendment, we can at least make sure the remote operating center isn't in Utah, where Resolution Copper is headquartered, or some other far-flung place. My amendment would require, as part of this legislation, that that center be located in Superior, and that the opportunities promised and the job created would go into that area. I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, the fundamental purpose of H.R. 687 is to facilitate a land exchange, and then after that land exchange was done, there would be a production and mining of copper, which of course would create thousands of jobs, American jobs. Now, the way this amendment is written, I have to say, Mr. Chairman, I think it would make it impossible by creating mandates that just simply couldn't be achieved. I have to give my friend from Arizona credit. He has made no bones about the fact that he does not like this bill. He said that very, very well. Now, I don't agree with him, but he has said it very well. Generally, when you offer an amendment to a bill, however, you offer an amendment to improve the bill. Believe me, Mr. Chairman, this will not improve the bill. In likelihood, if adopted, it would probably kill the bill, because it dictates a precise town where the mine operations should be. Now, I suspect that the company will have, some offices in those areas. That stands to reason if you're going to invest some money. But the federal government should not be dictating where somebody should set up an enterprise, specifically in what town. I mean, Mr. Chairman, if you want to go to the absurd, if the idea is to help a distressed area by dictating where you should locate some facility or manufacturing or some company, one could say that, gee whiz, what city in the United States is really hurting? First city that comes to mind, of course, is Detroit, Michigan. Are we going to suggest, for example, that the federal government dictate that Apple from Cupertino, California should be relocated to Detroit, for example? Of course, that's absurd. But yes, when you start this precedent here that is suggested in this amendment, one could lead to that conclusion in the future. So I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and pass the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Interestingly enough, the 687 does mandate that the federal government decide when and how NEPA is applied, that the federal government mandate what the valuation of the exchange is, independent of a process driven by the company, and it mandates that we deal with water issues after the fact, who gets water protection and who doesn't. All my bill, whether it is 10 jobs or 1,000 jobs, does is hold the company's feet to the fire. You have talked about jobs. You have talked about providing them and saving that community and rebounding the Arizona economy. Here's an opportunity by guaranteeing that that claim will indeed be a reality if this bill is implemented. I think my amendment actually improves it, because it takes some of the rhetoric of promoting a mine and makes it language and legislation that makes the company back it up. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I am very pleased to yield 1 minute to the sponsor of this legislation.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to reiterate, this isn't a new mine. This mine of operations exists currently there today. Modern-day practices that Resolution Copper plans to implement in Pinal County are not new. Many mines across the world implement them. In fact, there is a similar project, about half the size of our proposed project, that uses the same strategy and technology and employs 1,000 people. That is real-life proof that humans will work at this mine, at this site in Arizona. I thank the Chairman for yielding the opportunity, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the gentleman from Arizona has yielded back his time. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that, I would like to ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of the House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mr. Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I rise today to offer an amendment that would protect Native American sacred and cultural sites associated with the land conveyance outlined in the bill. This bill transfers land out of the public domain and into the hands of a private mining company with no guarantee of protecting sacred sites. Currently, the cultural and sacred sites of Apache Leap and Oak Flat are located on public land and not on an Indian reservation. Although these sites are not on an Indian reservation, they are still sacred to the San Carlos Apache, to the Yavapai Indian tribe, and other tribes in Arizona, just as a Catholic church, where I practice my faith, considered a holy place, even though it's not located in Vatican City. Because these sacred and cultural sites are currently on public land, they are protected under certain federal laws. This bill would transfer the lands that contain these sacred sites to a private company for private ownership, effectively taking away any protections under federal law. Additionally, it is important to protect the subsurface area of these sacred sites, which this bill does not do. Native American sacred sites, just as a church or a temple, have both surface and subsurface religious qualities. Would we allow subsurface mining below the National Cathedral? I would say not. I have heard from my colleagues that mining would take place below the ground and therefore leave the sacred sites undisturbed. But this is rather an absurd argument and, quite honestly, not factual. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Mexico reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Gosar.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to briefly address this amendment. The Lujan Amendment is well-intentioned but misguided. It would put forth a policy that would undermine existing law that ensures tribal consultation and protection of sacred sites. By giving the Secretary of Interior unilateral discretion to determine what a sacred site is, Congress would be unwillingly undermine a variety of public laws Congress put in place to protect verified sacred sites. Let me be clear. This land exchange is crafted in such a way as to protect relevant Native American historical and cultural sites. Section 4I and 4J explicitly require compliance with federal environmental laws and regulations pertaining to conveyances of federal land and approval of mine plan of operation. That includes National Historic Preservation Act, Endangered Species Act, executive orders pertaining to wetlands, floodplains, and hazardous material surveys. I see my colleague may have a picture of Apache Leap. My bill explicitly protects Apache Leap. The bill protects Apache Leap by the following. It conveys 110 acres of Apache Leap currently owned by Resolution Copper to the U.S. Forest Service. That would be Section 5A-E. Explicitly prohibits any type of extraction activity at Apache Leap, Section 5C. withdrawing Apache Leap and any land acquired by the U.S. under this Act, Section 7, requiring the Secretary to develop a management plan for Apache Leap that preserves the natural character of the site and protects archaeological and cultural resources, Section 8. Before I conclude, I want to underscore, H.R. 687 does not exchange any reservation lands. The next federal parcel is located over 20 miles from the boundaries of the San Carlos Apache Tribes Reservation. While well-intentioned, the Lujan Amendment actually undermines that very mission. Please join me in opposing amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the very distinguished member from Minnesota, one of the co-chairs of the Native American Caucus. 1 minute.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of this amendment. The United States has an obligation to protect and preserve Native American sacred sites located on federal lands. It is a responsibility we have established through federal laws, including the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act. Mr. Lujan's amendment would make sure that we follow these laws. That's what his amendment does. It protects these laws. That's why over 80 tribal organizations support our amendment. My colleagues who oppose this amendment, they claim that all sacred spaces have been protected in this bill. Those claims are simply false. The San Carlos Apache tribe is currently working with the Tonto National Forest to conduct a survey of their sacred sites. They have found artifacts and cultural materials and may yet still find burial sites in areas that are very proposed for exchange in this bill. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment so that the survey process and tribal consultations can continue. With that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Mexico. The gentleman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
I would tell my friend from New Mexico I'm prepared to close on this amendment if the gentleman is prepared to close.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I don't know where to begin with the comments suggested by one of my colleagues who I respect, Mr. Gosar. Mr. Chairman, look, I don't know how to be more clear. This sacred site is on public land. I think it would be a new low for this Congress to go and tell tribes across America that sacred sites that are not located on a reservation are no longer sacred. I'm surprised, I'm appalled, and I think tribes across the country would be as well. But let me be clear. Section 4I and 4J, I'd ask the author of the legislation to come back and maybe read it with me. The way that I read this, there's only one section of law that's referred to that can't be enforced because this is on private lands, not on public lands. And the area that's identified in the law is the National Environmental Policy Act. What happens when this land is given from a public perspective back to a private perspective is we lose the opportunity and ability to enforce the National Historic Preservation Act, the Native American Graves Preservation and Repatriation Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and the administration's December 2012 Memorandum of Understanding Protecting Sacred Sites. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record all of the organizations, including tribes across America and all the tribes from Arizona that are opposed to this underlying legislation.
The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave.
Now, Mr. Chairman, I have here not a picture of Apache Leap, but a picture of what happens with block cave mining. So even the poor attempt that talks about trying to address Apache Leap, the author of the legislation failed to include Oak Flat, which is a sacred site that would be covered here. Now, this is what happens with block cave mining. And don't take my word for it. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a presentation by Resolution Copper Mining, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's request will be considered by general leave.
Now, in this, which I wish I would have blown up, Resolution Copper shows pictures of how this starts to cave in so that it eventually looks like this. This is a common sense piece of legislation, and Mr. Chairman, in your words, this will improve the law. This will improve what we're trying to do here. This doesn't give the Secretary blanket authority to do anything. Let's just protect sacred sites and work together. The Congress has always done this. There's a reason why Democrats and Republicans have come together to create a Native American caucus and to advocate for tribes across America. The Congress has always stood strong.
Time has expired.
And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that my colleagues please give due consideration to support this amendment, and I hope to work with the majority and Chairman Hastings, who I respect very much, to try to get this addressed. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I have 3 minutes remaining.
That's correct.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it is critical that the Congress listen to and show respect to Indian tribes and their elected leaders. And Mr. Chairman, it's for that reason that when I have the privilege to become chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, a new subcommittee on Indian and Alaska Native Affairs was established. That hadn't been the case prior to my assuming the chairmanship of that committee. And the purpose was to ensure a special forum for issues and concerns important to Indian tribes and to Native people. It's important that Indian tribes have a role and are consulted on decisions that affect their land and their reservations' lands. But I just want to make a couple of points. This bill does not waive any existing laws dealing with Native Americans. None. None so whatsoever. And if I have time, I'll be more than happy to yield. But probably more specific on this. This area that we're talking about in Arizona, known as the Copper Triangle, has been mined for, well, a long time. And this particular land exchange is right kind of in the middle of this Copper Triangle. And the closest Indian reservation is some 20 miles away. Now, I understand that as in my area in central Washington, I know the Native Americans moved around, and that's certainly the case in Arizona. I understand that. But the effect of this amendment, would underlie our responsibility in Congress by giving total authority to the Secretary of the Interior to make determinations on whether sacred sites or other things important to Native Americans are violated. I think that's contrary to what our role is here. Again, this law does not waive any existing laws, none at all. In fact, we specifically, notwithstanding the fact that the nearest reservation is 20 miles away, we specifically say there should be consultation before this project goes forward. So I think this amendment is unnecessary, and I'd be happy to yield to my friend from New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that anyone is suggesting that items are being waived. The fact of the matter is, when land is transferred from a public domain to a private domain, it goes away. And that's the problem here. And I'm glad to hear and I know the profound respect that Chairman Hastings has for tribes across the country and the sacred sites protections that he's advocated for.
Reclaiming my time, reclaiming my time, just to make the point that the gentleman's amendment, the intent is to address Native American issues, and that's what we should be debating. And I'm just simply saying, if you affect Native American issues, by implication, you would be waiving them. We're not waiving anything. We're respecting the laws that are in place right now. Nothing changes under this, but except, as I said, the
gentleman's time has expired.
I urge a rejection of the amendment.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Those in favor say
yeas and nays.
Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully ask for the yeas and nays, even though there's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the floor.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mrs. Napolitano of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentlewoman of California, Mrs. Napolitano, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is very simple. On page 25, after line 12, it adds a new section, section 10. The savings clause would require that there be no adverse impacts on water quantity and water quality in the development of this project. This year, over half of our nation experiencing moderate to severe drought. As of last week, 75% of the state of Arizona is in moderate to severe drought. Life of blood of any nation, of any country, is water. We must do everything we can to protect this precious resource. Resolution Copper is a joint subsidiary of Australian BHP Billion and also of Anglo-Australian Rio Tinto Group. Mining activities would require an enormous amount of water, estimated to be more than 20 to 40,000 acre-feet per year. In fact, the Forest Service testified that understanding the impact of this mine on the local water supplies is still, quote and unquote, outstanding. On the average, 1 acre-foot of water is enough for water for a family of four for a year. Resolution Copper's water could use an equivalent to at least 20,000 household water supply for the year. They also erroneously suggest that their own water demands could be solved by the use of the Central Arizona Project water, called the CVP. However, as with most of the West, demand often exceeds supply, and a bulk of the water cap for the Central Arizona Project is already dedicated and committed to other use and users in Arizona. This includes for the use in future Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement. The proposed mining operation would also require significant excavation thousands of feet below the surface. H.R. 687 does not require an environmental review, does not include consideration of mitigation measures of the mining project before the land exchange is completed. And I repeat, it does not require environmental review, consideration of mitigation measures of the mining project before the land exchange is completed. The mining company is also not required to submit a plan of operations until 3 years after the land exchange is codified. Absent of the NEPA process, the impacts to water would not be known prior to the land exchange. Neighboring communities have already seen an impact to their water resources from other mining activities. Chairman Rambler of the San Carlos Apache tribe testified in March right here in Washington, D.C., that a neighboring community's water supply had been significantly depleted since Resolution Copper began pumping groundwater to dewater parts of the magnet mine. H.R. 687 permits the mine in Oak Flats, brings up similar concerns for that tribe. We would not be considering this legislation now since we don't know, we should not be considering it, those impacts to water resource for the area tribes. At the very least, we should ensure that we do not violate existing laws to protect water quantity and water quality. That is what amendment does. It protects the water quality and water quantity. My amendment seeks to protect our most precious resource, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purposes does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment because this amendment in no way risks water supply or safety. In fact, it upholds existing laws that protect water quality and availability. And probably the best way to illustrate that is to simply look at the support for this bill, especially from those that reside in the state of Arizona and represent people in the state of Arizona. We all know that Arizona is a very diverse state. I have a very diverse state, and Washington and certainly California is diverse geographically. But there are certain areas in that state that is pretty dry. Water is very, very important. Now, I dare say that no member from Arizona would support a bill that would jeopardize water in Arizona. And yet we have heard on the floor here the bipartisan support of those from Arizona representing Arizonans that support this bill. So I think that that issue, frankly, is simply not valid at all. It may sound like, this amendment may sound like it's well-intended, but what it really will do would end up, there would be red tape involved with this because the vagrancy of the language in this amendment. And I think really what this amendment is, in deference to my good friend from California, it's an open invitation. In fact, Mr. Chairman, you might call it an ambulance siren for lawyers to start filing lawsuits in this issue. One more area. Goodness knows there's going to be lawsuits anyway. This would be one more, in my view, if this amendment is passed. And finally, I would just say this. 100% of the water needs of this mine will be secured before production commences. And so with that, I urge rejection of the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might add that the town nearby, Superior, opposes this bill, and I believe the mayor was recently recalled because he also opposed it. And we have businesses and other entities supporting it, but the residents in the nearby areas, especially tribal areas, are opposed to it for a majority of reasons which have been brought up before, but also especially because they are in drought conditions and they're not assured that their water will be protected or that they will be able to have enough water for their own needs. And so I request that this amendment be included, and I'd like to introduce into the record the current drought monitor dated September the 24th, including the area which indicates it's still in drought condition.
The gentlewoman's request will be covered by general leave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't have any other speakers, so I yield back.
Okay, the gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the, again, sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another amendment that's well-intentioned but misguided. An amendment to include a savings clause assumes that my legislation circumvents existing laws protecting water quality and availability. That is simply not the case. The NEPA process on the mine plan of operation required by my legislation will be managed by the United States Forest Service, where they oversee an independent third-party consultant to assess all environmental impacts of the proposed resolution project, including impacts to groundwater and surface water. The NEPA process allows for considerable public as well as other federal, EPA, state, county, and local input all along the way. Any issues pertaining to water will be addressed once Resolution Copper files a mine plan of operation and the subsequent state and federal environmental analysis is conducted, as in accordance to existing law. This is like government overseeing government. That's ludicrous. And I ask my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
The gentleman from Washington.
And Mr. Chairman, I understand my friend from California has yielded back, so I would yield back after saying I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. Yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is
Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman from California.
Request recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part A of House Report 113-215, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona. Amendment number 3 by Ms. Napolitano of California. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 1, printed in Part A of the House Report 113-215 by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part A of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House this afternoon has been debating a bill that authorizes a land swap between the federal government and a resolution copper involving federal lands in Arizona. This is an amendment vote. This is an amendment proposed by Democrat Raul Grijalva of Arizona, who opposes the bill. His amendment would require for resolution copper to maintain a mining operation, remote operation center in Superior, Arizona. This is a 15-minute vote, and the remaining votes will be 5-minute votes. The House Republican leaders earlier today met with their conference, and they talked about the way forward on the continuing resolution and also about the debt ceiling issue. Chad Pergram of Fox News, who covers Capitol Hill, tweeted earlier about the earlier set of votes, saying the House GOP whip team took the temperature of where members are on the GOP debt ceiling plan during the last series of votes. Still no bill posted. The New York Times writing about what may be in the upcoming debt ceiling package in the House, that it could include or would include a one-year delay of the president's health care law, fast-track authority to overhaul the tax code, and construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline. I want to show you some of the comments following that briefing this morning from Speaker Boehner and from Majority Leader Eric Cantor.
Morning, everyone. Listen, the American people don't want the president's health care bill, and they don't want the government to shut down. Republicans are listening. We passed a bill last week that would do just what the American people have asked. It's time for the Senate to listen and pass the bill that we sent over there. On the debt limit, we're going to introduce a plan that ties important spending cuts and pro-growth reforms to a debt limit increase. Now, the president says, I'm not going to negotiate. Well, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work that way. We're not going to ignore Washington's spending problem, and we're not going to accept this new normal of a weak economy, no new jobs, and shrinking wages. So we need to strengthen our economy for all Americans, and we need to deal with Washington's spending problem.
Good morning. Speaker said last week we sent the Senate a continuing resolution that funds the government and stops Obamacare before it costs one more job or it costs families of this country one more dollar of discretionary income. And we also talked a lot today about a plan we're going to put forward this week. It is a plan to address the debt ceiling. We have a debt crisis in this nation. I don't think many people have differed with that notion. And we do have a plan to reduce wasteful government spending, which also spurs economic growth. So our plan reduces energy costs for families and businesses. It calls for the reform of our tax code. It reforms Washington's spending, and it delays Obamacare for 1 year for all American families. Now, President Obama has already delayed the law for big business, for insurance companies, and the politically connected. So this is only fair for us to say that American families should also have the benefit of delay that this president has given to those. Now, for too long, President Obama and his Democratic colleagues in the Senate have chosen to ignore our looming debt crisis. And President Obama's plan has been and is still more debt and no reform. And the American people have resoundingly rejected this idea. We have a recent poll out this morning, the Bloomberg poll, which says that the American people No, they don't want a government shutdown, but they are tired of the debt, and they want to make sure that this president sits down and negotiates with us a resolution to this problem. So we call on the president now to sit down with us, Harry Reid, to sit down with us and let's solve the problem. This plan of more debt and no reform is absolutely unacceptable. It's unacceptable to us, and it's unacceptable to the American people that we represent.
The Majority Leader and Speaker from this morning after their conference meeting talking about their pending debt ceiling measure. President Obama this morning speaking about the implementation of the health care law. He was in suburban Prince George's County, Maryland. He also addressed the looming debt ceiling. Here's some of what he had to say.
As for not letting America pay its bills, I have to say no Congress before this one has ever in history been irresponsible enough to threaten default, to threaten an economic shutdown, to suggest America not pay its bills just to try to blackmail a president into giving them some concessions on issues that have nothing to do with the budget. I mean, this is the United States of America. We're not a deadbeat nation. We don't run out on our tab. We don't not pay our note. We are the world's bedrock economy, the world's currency of choice. The entire world looks to us to make sure that the world economy is stable. You don't mess with that. You don't mess with that. And that's why I will not negotiate on anything when it comes to the full faith and credit of the United States of America. We're not going to submit to this kind of total irresponsibility. Congress needs to pay our bills on time. Congress needs to pass a budget on time. Congress needs to put an end to governing from crisis to crisis. Our focus as a country should be on creating new jobs and growing our economy and helping young people learn and restoring security for hard-working middle-class families. This is not about the fortunes of any one party. This is not about politics. This is about the future of our country. If Republicans do not like the law, they can go through the regular channels and processes to try to change it. That's why we have elections. So they can go through the normal processes and procedures of a democracy, but you do not threaten the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
President Obama from earlier today. Watch all of his comments on health care and the debt ceiling in our video library at cspan.org. Back live to the House floor. 2 amendment votes here on the bill dealing with Arizona federal land and the Resolution Copper Company. And joining us from Capitol Hill is Peter Schrader, who is a writer for The Hill. We're looking at the House and a couple of votes here on this Arizona land bill. But the attention today is focused on the Senate and their continuing debate on the resolution funding the federal government past September 30th. When will the Senate get around to a final vote on that?
Well, that's a bit of an open question. Early on, the speculation was that the Senate would hold on to the continuing resolution for some time, basically to give the House not a lot of time to negotiate and potentially put together a counteroffer that they could send back to the Senate. But right now, it appears that the Senate will move a little bit more quickly than originally thought, and it's possible that they could get to the bill sometime either maybe tomorrow or this weekend, but probably with enough time to send it back to the House for them to reconsider the offer that the Senate's sending over.
Well, in some of that briefing we showed our C-SPAN viewers, the Speaker and Majority Leader were talking mainly about the potential, the upcoming debt ceiling debate and what might be included in that package. But have they given any indication of what they might do, what the House might do when the CR comes back to the House?
Currently, GOP leaders in the House are indicating that they are going to be looking to attach something else to the CR when it comes back to the House. Obviously, when the House originally sent a funding bill to the Senate, it included a provision that would have defunded the President's health care reform law. Obviously, that's a bit of an issue for Democrats in the Senate. So as we expect, the Senate Democrats will probably strip that language out and send back a quote-unquote clean CR to the House, which would basically just continue funding levels for the government for some period of time. And if the House has enough time, which it appears that they will, the leaders have indicated that they'll be looking to attach some other sort of Republican priority to the legislation and then send it back over to the Senate for another round of consideration as we get close to this deadline here.
Oh, as you look at things now, where does the schedule take the House and the Senate heading into this weekend and all this?
Well, obviously the key question will be when the Senate actually votes on the CR and sends it back to the House. We have until the end of September 30th to avoid a government shutdown. The fiscal year begins October 1st, and if there's no sort of continuing resolution in place, then we will be dealing with a government shutdown. So if the Senate sends a bill back to the House in the next couple of days here, the House would theoretically have time to consider the legislation, attach some sort of an amendment to it, presumably pass it along party lines with Republican support, and send it back to the Senate, which would then have time to look at that and decide whether or not to advance that legislation or potentially try to hold firm on the demand for a clean CR.
Does it appear that House Republicans are now focusing their attention more on this debt ceiling discussion? A headline says that the House leaders are listing conditions for raising the debt ceiling, including not a defunding, but a delaying of the health care law.
It certainly seems to be the case. As I said earlier, the House CR that was originally sent over included the defunding provision, which was a large demand from conservative Republicans in the House. We expect that that language is going to be stripped out and will not end up being part of the continuing resolution. But instead, what we've seen from Republican leaders in the House is that they're beginning to put together their initial offer on raising the debt ceiling. They haven't actually produced a bill just yet, but a list of priorities that's circulating indicates that it's going to be a number of major GOP priorities, basically a number of bills that House Republicans have tried to advance in the past that Senate Democrats and the White House have been opposed to. As you mentioned, the one-year delay of the President's health care reform law. There's also going to be potentially the approval of the Keystone Pipeline, another major GOP priority on the energy front, as well as a number of proposals that would make it easier to trim regulations for the business community. So we're talking about a number of things that Republicans are very interested in seeing enacted, but at the same time, the White House and Senate Democrats are insisting they don't want to negotiate over the debt limit, so we're already positioning ourselves for another major fiscal fight in the coming weeks here.
As we kind of ping-pong between the House and the Senate here, back to the Senate for one last question. The continuing resolution, the cloture motion, when they vote cloture on the final bill, they need 60 votes on that, right?
That's correct.
Is there any indication that the Democrats have that now? Do they have the 6 Republicans they need?
It's not written in stone, and there's still haggling going on back and forth. Conservative Republicans in the Senate are urging the party to remain united and kind of hold the ground and see if they can protect that defunding language. But based on the language that we're hearing from some of the more moderate Republicans, it appears that if they don't have the 60 votes, they're on their way to it. It seems as if a number of Senate Republicans aren't really interested in being held responsible for a shutdown if that's what it comes to it. So, there's not a hard vote tally yet, and there's still a back and forth going on, but it seems as if the Democrats are in a relatively strong position.
You can read more at thehill.com. Peter Schrader, thanks for the update.
My pleasure.
And on the House floor, 2 amendment votes dealing with the Arizona federal land swap bill. This is a 15-minute vote. And during the remainder of this vote, we're going to take you to the briefing this morning from Senate Democratic leaders.
We're going to move forward just as quickly as we can. Under the present process, we'll finish Saturday. We can, as I said on the floor this morning, we can collapse that time to finish today. Having said that, if anyone here thinks the Republicans in the House have a workable plan for a shutdown on Monday, tell me about it. I get all kinds of reports from them. They're going to do this, they're going to do that. So we'll have to see what they decide to do, because right now they don't know. From everything I see, they're in this ditch, and they want to get out of it, but they keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper, and this ditch they can hardly see out of the top of it now. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't think they know what, as I said, they don't know what they're going to do. The Tea Party's put them in this hole, and the Tea Party keeps them digging deeper and deeper. We want to finish this legislation as quickly as possible. Every hour that ticks by puts our country closer to a shutdown. There's still time for cooler heads to prevail, but not a lot of time. I was so encouraged yesterday to see people come down who are Republicans and talk about the need to finish this legislation. There were a lot of good presentations. We've heard about what they were going to do with suicide, dumbest idea they ever heard, Box Canyon. But John McCain did the best yesterday. Obamacare is the law. It is the law. Has been for 4 years, declared constitutional. They've got to move on to something else. That was won fair and square. As John McCain said, he wished we hadn't won, but we did. Move on to something else. So I hope there's a few reasonable Republicans in the House that start talking like a few reasonable Republicans over here. We haven't seen it yet. This is not a game for the middle class, not an effort to satisfy the Koch brothers. This is dealing with their lives. I do my Welcome to Washington every Thursday. A woman from Boulder City, Nevada came to me and said, I appreciate your meeting with my 5 of my students. I appreciate that very much. But she said, you know, I work for the United States Park Service, and we are so afraid. We know if there's a CR, the parks are going to shut down. That will mean I won't have a job. It's through the federal government this way. That's what's happening in the stock market. The longest succession of down days since 2012, well more than a year. Because not only does someone that works at the Park Service not know what's going to happen, the financial markets don't know what's going to happen. This is really a sad, sad commentary on what's happening in the House. Again, I hope to pass this bill as quickly as possible. I hope the Republicans over here will stick with this. Senator Mikulski, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee.
You are. And then after me. No. We Democrats want to be sure that the government stays open and does the job that it's supposed to do. We Democrats want to keep the government open and is working as hard for the American people as the people who work hard to enable it to pay the bills. We are just days away from a government shutdown. The clock is ticking. You can see for itself. We have put forth a plan that does 2 things. Keep the government funding until November 15th to enable us to work out a longer-range solution. And number 2, we've got rid of the 2 riders that would be so provocative that they would be veto bait by the President of the United States. Let's be clear. Any attachment that either defunds or delays the Affordable Care Act will be vetoed by the President. You can huff, you can puff for 21 hours, but you cannot blow the Affordable Care Act away. So we have in our amendment, we eliminate the rider to defund Obamacare. We also eliminate the rider to reconstruct the way America would pay our bills, because we don't believe you should pay China first. We believe you should pay Social Security and veterans benefits first. And then we keep government open so that we can arrive at a process where we can move all of the funding for next year forward in a way that meets the missions, shows that we can be a more frugal government, and avoid a shutdown and this draconian effect of sequester. Make no mistake, shutdown is not theater. Shutdown has real consequences. If we go to a shutdown, lots of things will happen. First of all, for Social Security, you will get your benefits, but Social Security offices will either be closed or open only part-time, so your earned benefits, you won't even be able to apply for them. Even though we protect the veterans, the fact is that it will further make the disability claims process even more backlog. We don't want to do that. Thousands of students will be unable to pay their tuition because their loans will be delayed. Every single day, there will be another aspect of what a consequence of a shutdown is. And it's not only shutdown that's bad. We have to get to how we're going to fund our government for fiscal year 14. We want to be sure that we do it in a way that meets mission, meets purpose, and do it in a way that's fiscally responsible. But we have something called sequester. Sequester is a mechanism to do swashbuckling across-the-board cuts, no matter if the program is good or whether the program is dated. We oppose that. We want to cancel sequester for at least 2 years. Let me just give you one example. I have the proud honor to represent the National Institutes of Health in my state. Working there every day are people who've won the Nobel Prize, people who should win the Nobel Prize because they're out there finding cures for the diseases that affect the American people. This year, when they announced that cancer rates were reduced by 15% because of the work that had been done, instead of pinning medals on them, they were told they were going to get pink slips and be furloughed. Sequester means 5% cuts in 27 institutes and centers, whether they're on the cusp of a breakthrough or not. Whether you're dealing with an epidemic, a pan-epidemic, or whether you're dealing with the epidemic of Alzheimer's and autism in our country. We should be funding this, but oh no, we're going to cut the NIH by $2 billion, make sure that new grants are not funded, and make sure that people stand in line for the help that they need when they want to be admitted to the NIH hospital. This has consequences to lives, the future of our economy, where we come up with new ideas for new products. And if you want to save the budget, I'll give you with one fact. In our whole Medicaid funding, 80% of the beneficiaries are children, but 80% of the money goes to paying for long-term care because of Alzheimer's and because of Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease, and other neurological impediments. If you want to reduce the Medicaid budget, you fund NIH. So we find those cures that can help those people with those horrible diseases, help the family, and help our country. So let's get on with it. And let's stop huffing and puffing where the greatest deliberative body has become the greatest delayed body.
Thank you, Senator Reid and Senator Mikulski and Senators Murray and Schumer. There are only 5 days left in the fiscal year, and instead of working with Democrats to avoid a government shutdown, Republicans continue to march us right to the edge of another cliff. This week, the Senate's going to pass a clean, continuing resolution, funding the government at least until November 15th and giving us time to come together, pass a budget and the appropriations bills for the next year. This is the only sensible solution. Speaker Boehner, the House Republicans, the Tea Party members of the Senate, Senator Cruz and others, are playing high-stakes poker with other people's money. Let me tell you what I mean. Their threats are not going to affect them. Their threats are going to affect a lot of innocent people across America. You heard Senator Mikulski go through the litany of those who will be impacted by a government shutdown, not to mention the thousands of federal employees across America, uncertain today as to whether they're going to be needed at work on Tuesday morning and can show up. So the Republicans have decided that they're going to use them as pawns in this political debate. And if that isn't bad enough, they take the next step. The next step is to threaten the debt ceiling, the paying of bills by our federal government. If they stand by their position and don't give us a clean extension of the debt ceiling, the victims will include not just federal employees, but all employees across America. The economists that we've met with have made it extremely clear. The Business Roundtable has made it clear. This is a catastrophic strategy by the Republicans that will cost us jobs in America and cause businesses to throttle back instead of moving forward and hiring people, putting them back to work. So the Republicans are playing high-stakes poker with the lives of so many innocent people across America. It's time for this to come to an end.
The yeas are 180, the nays are 227. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of the House Report 113-215 by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Napolitano, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed in a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part